All right. We are on section 3, part 2 of Into the Wild. So today we will be reading pages 87 to page 98. So this is chapter 9 in your book. All right, chapter 9, Davis Gulch. As to when I shall visit civilization, it will not be soon, I think. I have not tired of the wilderness. Rather, I enjoy its beauty and the vagrant life I lead more keenly all the time. I prefer the saddle to the streetcar, and the star-sprinkled sky to a roof, the obscure and difficult trail leading into the unknown to any paved highway, and the deep peace of the wild to the discontent bred by cities. Do you blame me then for staying here, when I feel that I belong and am one with the world around me? It is true that I miss intelligent companionship, but there are so few with whom I can share the things that mean so much to me that I have learned to contain myself. It is enough that I am surrounded with beauty. Even from your scant description, I know that I could not bear the routine and humdrum of the life that you are forced to lead. I don't think I could ever settle down. I have known too much of the depths of life already, and I would prefer anything to an anticlimax. And that's from the last letter ever received from Everett Roos to his brother Waldo, and that's November 11th, 1934. What Everett Roos was after was beauty, and he conceived beauty in pretty romantic terms. We might be inclined to laugh at the extravagance of his beauty worship, if there were not something almost magnificent in his single-minded dedication to it. Aesthetics as a parlor affection is ludicrous, and sometimes a little obscene. As a way of life, it sometimes attains dignity. If we laugh at Everett Roos, we shall have to laugh at John Muir, because there was little difference between them except age. And that's Wallace Stegner from Mormon Country. All right, now we're getting into the actual narrative of the chapter. Davis Creek is only a trickle during most of the year, and sometimes not even that. Originating at the foot of a high rock battlement known as 50 Mile Point, the stream flows just 4 miles across the pink sandstone slabs of southern Utah before surrendering its modest waters to Lake Powell, the giant reservoir that stretches 190 miles above Glen Canyon Dam. Davis Gulch is a small watershed by any measure, but a lovely one, and travelers through this dry, hard country have for centuries relied on the oasis that exists at the bottom of the slot-like defile. Eerie 900-year-old petroglyphs and pictographs decorate its sheer walls. Crumbling stone dwellings of the long-vanished Kayaneta Anasazi, the creators of the rock art, nestle in protective nooks. Ancient Anansi potsherds mingle in the sand with rusty tin cans discarded by turn-of-the-century stockmen who grazed and watered their animals in the canyon. For most of its short length, Davis Gulch exists in a deep, twisting gash in the slick rock, narrow enough in places to split across, lined by overhanging sandstone walls that bar access to the canyon floor. There's a hidden route into the gulch at its lower end, however, just upstream where the Davis Creek flows into Lake Powell. A natural ramp zigzags down from the canyon's west rim. Not far above the creek bottom, the ramp ends, and a crude staircase appears, chiseled into soft sandstone by Mormon cattlemen nearly a century ago. The country surrounding Davis Gulch is a desiccated expanse of bald rock and brick red sand. Vegetation is lean. Sorry, my cat is using a scratching post. right. Vegetation is lean. Shade from the withering sun is virtually non-existent. To descend into the confines of the canyon, however, is to arrive at another world. Cottonwoods lean gracefully over drifts of flowering prickly pear. Tall grasses sway in the breeze. The ephemeral bloom of a sago lily peeks from the toe of a 90-foot stone arch. Really? Right now? Okay. From a 90-foot stone arch. And canyon wrens call back and forth in the plaintive tones from a thatch of scrub oak. High above the creek, a spring seeps from the cliff face, irrigating a growth of moss and the maidenhair fern that hangs from the rock in a lush green mat. 6 decades ago, this enchanting hideaway, less than a mile downstream from where the Mormon steps meet the floor of the gulch, 20-year-old Everett Roos carved his nom de plume into the canyon wall below a panel of Anansi pictographs, and did so again in the doorway of a small masonry structure built by the Anansi for storing grain. Nemo, 1934. He scrawled, no doubt moved by the same impulse that compelled Chris McCandless to inscribe Alexander Supertramp, May 1992, on the wall of the Sushana bus. An impulse not so different, perhaps, from what inspired the Anansi to embellish the rock with their own, now indecipherable symbols. In any case, shortly after Roos carved his mark into the sandstone, he departed Davis Gulch and mysteriously disappeared, apparently by design. An extensive search shed no light on his whereabouts. He was simply gone, swallowed whole by the desert. 60 years later, we still know next to nothing about what became of him. Everett Roos was born in Oakland, California in 1914, the younger of 2 sons raised by Christopher and Stella Roos. Christopher, a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, was a poet, a philosopher, and a Unitarian minister, although he earned his keep as a bureaucrat in the California penal system. Stella was a headstrong woman with bohemian tastes and driving artistic ambitions, for both herself and her kin. She self-published a literary journal, The Roos Quartet, the cover of which was emblazoned with the family maxim, glorify the hour. A tight-knit bunch, the Rooses were also a nomadic family, moving from Oakland to Fresno to LA, to Boston to Brooklyn to New Jersey to Indiana before finally settling in Southern California, where Everett Roos was 14. In Los Angeles, Everett attended the Otis Art School and the Hollywood High. As a 16-year-old, he embarked on his first long solo trip, spending the summer of 1930 hitchhiking and trekking through Yosemite and Big Sur, ultimately winding up in Carmel. I was just there over the summer. 2 days after arriving in the latter community, he brazenly knocked on the door of Edward Weston, who was sufficiently charmed by the overwrought young man to humor him. We are on the top of page 90. Over the next 2 months, the eminent photographer encouraged the boys' uneven but promising efforts at painting and block printing, and permitted Roos to hang around his studio with his own sons, Neil and Cole. At the end of the summer, Everett returned home only long enough to earn a high school diploma, which he received in January 1931. Less than a month later, he was on the road again, tramping alone through the canyonlands of Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Then, a region nearly as sparsely populated and wrapped in mystique as Alaska is today, except for a short, unhappy stint at UCLA. He dropped out after a single semester, to his father's lasting dismay. 2 extended visits with his parents, and a winter in San Francisco, where he insinuated himself into the company of Dorothea Lange, Ansel Adams, and the painter Maynard Dixon. Roos would spend the remainder of his meteoric life on the move. Hey, don't scratch the couch. On the move. Living out of a backpack on very little money, sleeping in the dirt, cheerfully going hungry for days at a time. Roos was, in the words of Wallace Stegner, a callow romantic, an adolescent aesthete, an atavistic wanderer of the wastelands. At 18, in a dream, he saw himself plodding through jungles, chinning up ledges of cliffs, wandering through the romantic waste places of the world. No man of any of the juices of boyhood in him forgotten in those dreams. The particular thing about Everett Roos was that he went out and did the things he dreamed about, not simply for a 2 weeks vacation in the civilized and trimmed wonderlands, but for months and years in the very midst of wonder. Deliberately, he punished his body, strained his endurance, tested his capacity for strenuousness. He took out deliberately over trails that Indians and old-timers warned him against. He tackled cliffs that more than once left him dangling halfway between talus and rim. From his camps by the water pockets or the canyons or on high timbered ridges of Navajo Mountain, he wrote long, lush, enthusiastic letters to his family and friends, damning the stereotypes of civilization, chanting his barbaric adolescent yop into the teeth of the world. We're on the top of 91. Roos turned out many such letters, which bore the postmarks of the remote settlements through which he passed. Canada, Chinle, Lucachaki, Zion Canyon, Grand Canyon, Mesa Verde, Escalante, Rainbow Bridge, Canyon de Chelly. Reading with this correspondence, collected W.L. Rousseau's meticulously researched biography, Everett Roos, A Vagabond for Beauty, one is struck by Roos's craving for connection with the natural world, and by his almost incendiary passion for the country through which he walked. I had some terrific experiences in the wilderness since I wrote you last. Overpowering, overwhelming. He gushed to his friend Cornell Tengel. But then, I'm always being overwhelmed. I require it to sustain life. Everett Roos's correspondence revealed uncanny parallels between Roos and Chris McCandless. Here are excerpts from 3 of Roos's letters. I've been thinking more and more that I shall always be a lone wanderer of the wilderness. God, how the trail lures me. You cannot comprehend its restless fascination for me. After all, the lone trail is the best. I'll never stop wandering. And when the time comes to die, I'll find the wildest, loneliest, most desolate spot there is. The beauty of this country is becoming part of me. I feel more detached from life and somehow gentler. I have some good friends here, but no one really understands why I am here or what I do. I don't know of anyone, though, who would have more than a partial understanding. I've gone too far alone. I've always been unsatisfied with life as most people live it. Always I want to live more intensely and richly. In my wanderings this year, I have taken more chances and had more wild adventures than ever before. And what magnificent country I have seen. Wild, tremendous, wasteland, trenches. Lost mesas, blue mountains rearing upward from the vermilion sands of the desert. Canyons 5 feet wide at the bottom of hundreds of feet deep. Cloudbursts roaring down unnamed canyons, and hundreds of houses on cliff dwellers, abandoned 1,000 years ago. A half-century later, McCandless sounds eerily like Roos when he declares in a postcard to Wayne Westberg that I've decided that I'm going to live this life for some time to come. The freedom and simple beauty of it is too good to pass up. And echoes of Roos can be heard as well in McCandless' last letter to Ronald Franz. Roos was just as romantic as McCandless, if not more so, and equally heedless of personal safety. Claiborne Lockett an archaeologist who briefly employed Roos as a cook while excavating an Anansi Cliff dwelling in 1934, told Rousseau that he was appalled by the seemingly reckless manner in which Everett moved around dangerous cliffs. Indeed, Roos himself boasts in one of his letters, "Hundreds of times I have trusted my life to crumbling sandstone and nearly vertical edges in search of water or cliff dwellings. Twice I was nearly gored to death by a wild bull, but always, so far, I have escaped unscathed and gone forth to other adventures." And in his final letter, Roos nonchalantly confesses to his brother, "I have had a few narrow escapes from rattlers and crumbling cliffs. The last misadventure occurred when Chocolatero, his burro," a burro's like a donkey if you don't know, "stirred up some wild bees. A few more stings might have been too much for me. I was 3 or 4 days getting my eyes open and recovering the use of my hands." Also, like McCandless, Roos was undeterred by the physical discomfort. At times, he seemed to welcome it. "For 6 days, I've been suffering from the semi-annual poison ivy case. My sufferings are far from over," he tells his friend Bill Jacobs. He goes on at the top of 93. "For 2 days, I couldn't tell whether I was dead or alive. I writhed and twisted in the heat, with swarms of ants and flies crawling over me, while the poison oozed and crusted on my face and arms and back. I ate nothing. There was nothing to do but suffer philosophically. I get it every time, but I refuse to be driven out of the woods." And like McCandless, upon embarking on his terminal odyssey, Roos adopted a new name, or rather a series of new names. In a letter dated March 1st, 1931, he informs his family that he has taken to calling himself Lan Rameau, and requests that they please respect my brush name. How do you say it in French? Nom de bruche, or what? 2 months later, however, another letter explains, "I have changed my name again to Everett Roulan. Those who knew me formerly thought my name was freakish and an affectation of Frenchiness." And then in August of that same year, with no explanation, he goes back to calling himself Everett Roos and continues to do so for the next 3 years, until wandering into Davis Gulch. There, for some unknowable reason, Everett twice etched the name Nemo, Latin for nobody, into the Navajo sandstone, and then vanished. He was 20 years old. The last letters anyone received from Roos were posted from the Mormon settlement of Escalante, 57 miles north of Davis Gulch, on November 11th, 1934. Addressed to his parents and his brother, they indicate that he would be incommunicado for a month or 2. 8 days after mailing them, Roos encountered 2 sheep herders about a mile from the gulch and spent 2 nights in their camp. These men were the last people known to have seen the youth alive. Some 3 months later, Roos departed Escalante. His parents received a bundle of unopened mail forwarded from the postmaster at Marble Canyon, Arizona, where Everett was long overdue. Worried, Christopher and Stella Roos contacted the authorities in Escalante, who organized a search party in early March 1935. Starting up from the sheep camp where Roos was last seen, they began combing the surrounding country and very quickly found Everett's 2 burros at the bottom of Davis Gulch, grazing contentedly behind a makeshift corral fashioned from brush and tree limbs. The burros were confined in the upper canyon, just upstream from where the Mormon steps intersect from the floor of the gulch. A short distance downstream, the searchers found unmistakable evidence of Roos's camp. And then, in the doorway of an Anansi granary, below a magnificent natural arch, they came across Nemo 1934, carved into a stone slab. 4 Anansi posts were carefully arranged on a rock nearby. 3 months later, searchers came across another Nemo graffito a little farther down the gulch. The rising waters of Lake Powell, which began to fill upon the completion of the Glen Canyon Dam in 1963, have long since been erased have long since erased both inscriptions. But except for the burrows and their track, none of Roos's possessions, his camping paraphernalia, journals, and paintings were ever found. It is widely believed that Roos fell to his death while scrambling on one or another canyon wall. Given the treacherous nature of the local topography, most of the cliffs that riddle the region are composed of Navajo sandstone, a crumbly stratum that erodes into smooth, bulging precipices, and Roos's penchant for dangerous climbing. This is a credible scenario. Careful searches of cliffs near and far, however, have failed to unearth any human remains. And how to account for the fact that Roos apparently left his gulch with a heavy load of gear, but without his pack animals? These bewildering circumstances have led investigators to conclude that Roos was murdered by a team of cattle rustlers known to have been in the area, who stole his belongings and buried his remains or threw them into the Colorado River. This theory, too, is plausible, but no concrete evidence exists to prove it. Shortly after Everett's disappearance, his father suggested that the boy had probably been inspired to call himself Nemo by Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a book Everett read many times, in which the pure-hearted protagonist, Captain Nemo, flees civilization and severs his every tie upon the earth. Everett's biographer, W.L. Rousseau, agrees with Christopher Roos's assessment, arguing that Everett's withdrawal from organized society, his disdain for worldly pleasures, and his signatures as Nemo in Davis Gulch all strongly suggest that he closely identified with Jules Verne's character. Roos's apparent fascination with Captain Nemo has fed speculation among more than a few Roos mythographers that Everett pulled a fast one on the world after leaving Davis Gulch and is or was very much alive, quietly residing somewhere under an assumed identity. A year ago, while filling my truck with gas in Kingman, Arizona, I happened to strike up a conversation about Roos with a middle-aged pump attendant, a small, twitchy man with flecks of skull staining the corners of his mouth. Speaking with persuasive conviction, he swore that he knew a fella who'd definitely bumped into Roos in the late 1960s at a remote hogan on the Navajo Indian Reservation. According to the attendant's friend, Roos was married to a Navajo woman, with whom he'd raised at least one child. The veracity of this and other reports of relatively recent Roos sightings, needless to say, is extremely suspect. Ken Slate, who has spent much of his time investigating the riddle of Roos as any other person, is convinced that the boy died in 1934 or early 1935, and believes he knows how Roos met his end. Slate, 65 years old, is a professional river guide and desert rat with a Mormon upbringing and a reputation for insolence. When Edward Abbey was writing The Monkey Wrench Gang, his picturesque novel about ecoterrorism in the Canyon Country, his pal Ken Slate was said to have inspired the character Seldom Seen Smith. Slate has lived in the region for 40 years, visited virtually all the places Roos visited, talked to many people who crossed paths with Roos, taken Roos's older brother Waldo into the Davis Gulch to visit the site of Everett's disappearance. Waldo thinks Everett was murdered, Slate says, but I don't think so. I lived in Escalante for 2 years. I've talked with the folks who are accused of killing him, and I just don't think they did it. But who knows? You can't ever really tell what a person does in secret. Other folks believe Everett fell off a cliff. Well, yeah, he could have done that. It'd be an easy thing to do in that country, but I don't think that's what happened. I tell you what I think. I think he drowned. Years ago, when hiking down Grand Gulch, a tributary of the San Juan River, some 40 miles due east of Davis Gulch, Slate discovered the name Nemo carved into the soft mud mortar of an Anansi granary. Slate speculates that Roos inscribed this Nemo not long after departing Davis Gulch. After corralling his burros in Davis, says Slate, Roos hid all his stuff in a cave somewhere and took off, playing Captain Nemo. He had Indian friends down on the Navajo reservation, and that's where I think he was heading. A logical route to Navajo country would have taken Roos across the Colorado River at Hole in the Rock, then along a rugged trail pioneered in 1880 by Mormon settlers, across Wilson Mesa and the Clay Hills, then finally down Grand Gulch and the San Juan River, across which lay the reservation. Everett carved his Nemo on the ruin in Grand Gulch, about a mile below where Collins Creek comes in, then continued on down to San Juan. And when he tried to swim across the river, he drowned. That's what I think. Slate believes that Roos had made it across the river alive and reached the reservation. It would have been impossible for him to conceal his presence. Even if he was still playing his Nemo game, Everett was a loner, but he liked people too darn much to stay down there and live in secret for the rest of his life. A lot of us are like that. I'm like that. Ed Abbey was like that, and it sounds like this McCandless kid was like that. We like companionship, see? But we can't stand to be around people for very long. So we go get ourselves lost, come back for a while, and get the heck out again. And that's what Everett was doing. Everett was strange, Slate concedes, kind of different. But him and McCandless, at least they tried to follow their dream. That's what's great about them. They tried. Not many do. In attempting to understand Everett Roos and Chris McCandless, it can be illuminating to consider the deeds in a larger context. It's helpful to look at counterparts from a distant place and a century far removed. Off in the southeastern coast of Iceland sits a low barrier island called Paphos. Treeless and rocky, perpetually clobbered by gales howling off the North Atlantic. It takes its name from the first settlers, now long gone, the Irish monks known as Papar. Walking this gnarled shore on one summer afternoon, I blundered upon a matrix of faint stone rectangles embedded in the tundra. Vestiges of the monks' ancient dwellings, hundreds of years old, even than the Nancy ruins in Davis Gulch. The monks arrived as early as the 5th and 6th centuries AD, having sailed and rowed from the west coast of Ireland, setting out in small open boats called carafes, built from cowhide stretched over light wicker frames. They crossed one of the most treacherous stretches of ocean in the world, without knowing what, if anything, they'd find on the other side. The Papar risked their lives and lost them in untold droves, not in the pursuit of wealth or personal glory, or to claim new lands in the name of any despot. As the great Arctic explorer and Nobel laureate Fridtjof Nansen points out, these remarkable voyages were undertaken chiefly from the wish to find lonely places, where these anchorites may dwell in peace, undisturbed by the turmoil and temptations of the world. When the first handful of Norwegians showed up on the shores of Iceland in the 9th century, the Papar decided the country had become too crowded, even though it was still all but uninhabited. The monks' response was to climb into their carafes and row toward Greenland. They were drawn across the storm-racked ocean, drawn west past the edge of the unknown world by nothing more than hunger of the spirit, a yearning of such strange intensity that it beggars the modern imagination. Reading of these monks, one is moved by their courage, their reckless innocence, and the urgency of their desire. Reading of these monks, one can't help but think of Everett Roos and Chris McCandless. All right, that is all for section number 3. So I will see you next week, where we will start on page 98. Thank you very much.